Howdy folks, Ryan here, back with another Matt Brunick style hostage video in the interim. You may remember in my last video I was talking about how we could have avoided the Great Recession. One thing that I didn't mention, which my friend Marshall Steinbaum pointed out on Twitter, was the housing crisis. And so while the President Obama and the Obama administration, could have done a lot more in terms of fiscal stimulus, they also had even more explicit tools that they didn't use to stave off the worst economic damage of the housing bubble. So this is kind of a sequel to that video. You may want to watch it first if you haven't seen it. So basically, during the housing bubble, you had this massive run up of home values and then, a big collapse. And that was, something on the order of $1 trillion of wealth that disappeared. Home values added up that disappeared. And also, those mortgages had been packaged into financial instruments. They were in banks all over the world, that sort of thing. So who's going to take the hit? There are basically, three possible options. Either the banks could have taken the hit, or the government could have taken the hit, or homeowners could have taken the hit. And the Obama administration effectively chose doors number 2 and 3. And so let me get into some of the sources here, which I'll link. This is a blog post from like a financial analyst named Carolyn Sissoko, but she has a very technical argument in here, but it's not, all that difficult to understand. I'll just summarize the main points of it here. Basically, there are three mechanisms here. The government took on a ton of default risk through the Treasury Department and the Federal Reserve buying tons of mortgage-backed securities that were, full of these subprime toxic waste loans. And then the Federal Housing Administration stepped in to replace subprime mortgage issuers as a source of credit. And that's right in here. And this meant that you had a wave of mass refinancing happening in 2009 under the protection of the government umbrella. You had basically people moving from loans, that were privately issued and put risk on banks to government-backed loans in one way or another, either owned by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac or the Federal Reserve or insured by the Federal Housing Administration. And so this chart right here gives you a little sense of it. I don't want to go through all the mechanisms exactly, but, they were making tons of these loans. And this is the seriously delinquent vintage rate curves by fiscal year. Like basically what percentage of these loans that were made ended up being delinquent in their payments by the year, by how long since the loan was originated. And this was done in like 2014, something like that. Anyway, you could see these loans that were made in 2007, 2008, 2006, 2009, they had very high delinquency rates, up to 20%, 25%, 27%, something like that for the worst batch of them. And basically, the government just ate a ton of losses on those suckers. Second thing is that the Obama administration blocked cramdown legislation. So what is cramdown? Cramdown is would be a change in the bankruptcy law that would allow someone in a bankruptcy proceeding to write down the value of their mortgage on their primary residence to the market value. So basically, if your mortgage is underwater, if you owe more on your house than the house is actually worth, and you end up in bankruptcy, one thing you could do is write off all the debt that is more than the value of the house. And Obama actually promised that he would do this. It's a ProPublica article from 2011. Before he took office, President Obama repeatedly promised voters and Democrats in Congress that he'd fight for changes to bankruptcy laws to help homeowners. Then they didn't do that. Basically, the Tim Geithner was the main person here, the Treasury Secretary. He basically intrigued behind the scenes, and he got enough votes in the Senate to like shoot this proposal down. Why did they do that? Well, what would have happened, they feared at least, more on this in a second, that if you were to let the cramdown provision through, what you would get is mass refinance, people declaring bankruptcy. Everybody who had a seriously underwater mortgage would go through the bankruptcy proceeding, take the hit to their credit just to wipe away, in some cases like hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt. And that would have blown a pretty big hole in the bank's balance sheets. And Geithner and the rest of the neoliberal economists in the Obama administration were very wary about doing that. And so they blocked this change in the law. The third thing they did, I can just go back to full screen here, was they basically botched the Homeowner Assistance legislation that was part of the bank bailout in 2007. So my boss at the American Prospect wrote a whole book about this. It's called Chain of Title, about how the Obama administration screwed the pooch. And it's, again, a very complicated business. But to simplify a long story, as I was saying in my previous video, during the initial financial crisis in 2008, the first version of the TARP bailout, the bank bailout, didn't pass. And Democrats controlled both the House and the Senate at the time. And so, Democrats controlled both the House and the Senate at the time, so they were given the votes for this thing. And so they used that to put a few more asks in the bank bailout bill. One of them was a pot of undefined amount for homeowner assistance. They figured, well, if the banks are going to be, getting all this money, then the homeowners should probably get some too. It's only fair. And they figured that because Obama is likely going to win the election in 2008, then he'll probably do a good job on this. That turned out to be totally wrong. The major villain here, again, you can read it in the book. This was Tim Geithner. Just like with cramdown, the most effective type of homeowner assistance would be to do principal reductions, to basically set up a program where you allow people to write down the value of their mortgages outside of a bankruptcy proceeding. The administration didn't do this intentionally. Geithner designed what would become the Home Affordable Modification Program, or HAMP. As such a bureaucratic disaster, it helped almost no one. In fact, a lot of people were tricked into foreclosure by the servicers who managed the loan payments without owning the loan itself and had a lot of incentives to foreclose. Then Obama ignored legal leverage that he had to help homeowners. Again, this is all in the book Chain of Title. This is like the big part of that book, in fact. So during the bubble, when they were taking these mortgages and slicing and dicing them and piling them into all these crazy securities and whatnot, the banks had been really careless with the paperwork. And that was in part because the whole purpose of these, securities was to obscure what was actually in the security itself, to make it really hard to figure out. And so when the bubble popped and they went to foreclose on people, a lot of times, in fact, probably the majority of the time, they figured that they couldn't find the paperwork. They didn't have the mortgage note or the chain of title showing how possession had changed hands. all the things that you need to go to a foreclosure proceeding. So what do? They forged them all. They forged the documents on an industrial scale. This was the Robosigning Scandal. That here's another article just to give a sample of the coverage. That this was a low-level executive at a mortgage records company, but all the banks had or knew about that contractors or subsidiaries had whole floors of people that were committing document fraud hundreds of times a day. People were paid like $13 an hour to falsely attest to, personal knowledge of some, complicated mortgage file that was like, a foot thick. And that was just so that they, on the rare occasions that somebody would actually contest their foreclosure in court, they could have the fake documents to actually go through the foreclosure thing. And the thing about this is that, again, this gave the Obama administration huge leverage. It's illegal to foreclose on somebody with forged documents. It's stealing because you don't own, if you can't prove that you own the mortgage, you don't own it. Under New York law, which governs all these securities that are, made and diced up in Wall Street, any security that didn't follow the terms of the original contract is void. So, when you're selling a security, you can't make up the paperwork in there, obviously. And under federal tax law, income from securities without proper documentation could be taxed at 100% potentially. So at the very least, the Obama administration, in particular, the law enforcement department, could have used the threat of prosecutions to bring the banks to the table and force them to agree to sweeping concessions to homeowners, a type of, principal reductions, write downs of debt and so on. He didn't do that either. The IRS and the FBI, they basically sat on their hands, and so did the Department of Justice. And when there was a whole bunch of state attorneys general filed a combined lawsuit over the scandal, Obama people stepped in and they made it basically a slap on the wrist. And again, they did this for the same reason that, if you had lots of, concessions to homeowners in this legal, through this legal system, then you would have caused big damage to banks' balance sheets, or at least that's what they thought, what they had sort of committed themselves to doing. And so they didn't do it. The inspector general of the TARP bailout, a guy named Neil Borofsky, he explained the whole thing on an episode of Morning Joe.
And that's sort of another area. You have a housing program that was supposed to spend $50 billion to help struggling homeowners. And as I detail in the book, Geithner admitted to us that it was really more about, in his words, foaming the runway for the banks. And the result, a program that to date has spent just around $3 of the $50 billion promise.
The Treasury Secretary admitted
foaming the runway for the banks.
That was more about foaming the runway for the banks.
What he said was that the banks can handle a certain number of million of foreclosures over a certain period of time. Any more than that would put them in jeopardy. And this program would help foam the runway, help stretch out the foreclosure crisis.
So yeah, it's really, it's a complicated business, but it's that simple at the end of the day. Later, we got even more explicit proof of this in another book. I've quoted this one before, A Crisis Wasted, by Reed Hunt. This is really good read, by a top Democratic insider who was a major fundraising bundler for Obama, and wrote about, got a lot of people on the record talking about this stuff. He talked to two administration economists, Austin Goolsbee and Christy Romer. And they said straight up that they ruled out pushing mortgage losses onto the financial sector that had, made all these bad loans in the first place. Goolsbee said, quote, "We absolutely thought about it and understood there were a bunch of people underwater, and if we could, we'd like to do the write-downs. The only problem was that there were $750 billion of negative equity in housing, the amount that mortgages exceeded the value of the houses. Somebody would have to eat that money. For sure, the banks couldn't take $750 billion of losses, and for sure, the government wasn't willing to give $750 billion in subsidies to underwater homeowners, to say nothing of the anger it would engender among non-underwater homeowners. Romer said, quote, there was about $1 trillion of negative equity, and getting rid of it would have helped increase consumer spending and heal the economy. But for the government to just absorb it, it would have been very expensive. So, they convinced themselves that the banks couldn't take the loss from the housing bubble, so the government, and especially homeowners, ate the losses instead. So what could have been done instead? In the first place, it's not actually clear that helping homeowners would have actually hurt the banks all that much. By mid-2009, the crisis, the acute part of the crisis is over, and by 2010, banks were again making big profits. If you force them to eat a bunch of foreclosure losses, maybe a few $100 billion over several years, it probably wouldn't have been that bad. Or if you wanted to be safe, you could have set up a garbage bank, stuffed all of this trash debt into it, and then disconnected it from the rest of the financial system and let it go bankrupt. Write the debt off that way. And in fact, Obama, in a sort of fit of frustration, actually ordered Tim Geithner to look into plans for doing this exactly to Citigroup. Right here, this is another article by David Dayen, once more, from several years ago. According to credible accounts, Geithner slow-walked a direct presidential order to prepare the breakup of Citigroup, instead undertaking other measures to nurse the insolvent bank back to health. As usual, Obama didn't do anything, and it's just like blatant disloyalty. Even if we did have, the pushing losses onto banks that cause a crisis, we'd just seen how it could have been resolved. The financial crisis gives the government enormous leverage to fix the problem because it causes a panic. That's how the TARP bailout passed in the first place. It would have been a perfect excuse to blame Wall Street for its atrocious misdeeds and pass another rescue package that wouldn't have been so blatantly favorable to the banks. In fact, if you were smart, that's how you would have done the TARP thing in the first place. Could have broken up the banks, attached stiff new regulations, included more benefits from homeowners and everyone else. But at the very least, the Obama administration, and this is again in Hunt's book, had another more than $200 billion of money appropriated in the original bailout that they did not spend. They, in fact, refused to spend. And so let's, consider here's median home value prices, nominal dollars, in 2011, you're looking at something on the order of $175,000 for the median house. And, let's just round up to 200 to be, conservative. You could have completely written off something like 1 million home loans if you wanted to take that $200 billion and just use it to wipe out mortgages. If you wanted to, use it as part of a refinancing, scheme, you could have gotten 5-6 million, something like that. Instead, they did basically nothing. And the actual number of people forced out of their homes was something like 10 million through foreclosures and other changes. And the people that weren't forced out of their homes, a lot of them ended up and maybe still are paying on inflated mortgages from the bubble years, paying money on homes that are not, that are still underwater. Maybe they're just now starting to climb out from under that hole. And that was, a solid decade at least of just straight up transfers of wealth from middle class homeowners to Wall Street to save them from their own misdeeds. So why did they do this? There are two obvious theories. You got corruption and you got neoliberalism. So corruption is obvious. What's Geithner up to now? Here's a story from the Washington Post, 2018. Monetizing poor people with predatory high interest loans that they just mail to random people and hope they cash a check. Oh, this poor bastard. Wow. Cash a check. He needed repairs. This company's suing him for over $1,200 loan with a 33% interest rate. Who owns it? Owned and managed by a $11.2 billion private equity fund controlled by Warburg Pincus. The president of Warburg Pincus is Timothy F. Geithner, who, as Treasury Secretary in the Obama administration, condemns predatory lenders. And it goes without saying that you don't get a job like that if your tenure as Treasury Secretary included like bloodthirsty crackdowns on Wall Street swindlers. Doesn't happen. The neoliberalism angle is a little more complicated, but you know, one of the foundational beliefs of neoliberalism is that the primary task of government is to ensure that, you know, the private market is functioning, you know, appropriately, smoothly. You're supposed to just incentivize private business to buy and sell goods in the market. So that means it's fine when the system, the market system is like falling to pieces to jump in and fix things, you know, and bail people out. But when the system is functioning normally and there's just untold social carnage as a result of the functioning of that system, then they get all timid and hesitant. Hunt says in his book, again, he writes, quote, the truth in 2009 was this: Obama could do almost anything he wanted about the crisis. His advisors suffered from stultifying discomfort with that power. And that's something you see today. So anyway, that's just a little addendum to my previous video. Like, subscribe, sign up to my newsletter, pick up a copy of my book if you want to support the channel. Topic suggestions, always welcome in the comments. My next video is going to be about how Glenn Greenwald turned into a right-wing blowhard. So stay tuned for that one.